what we've seen so far was that David was chosen by God to replace Saul, who was a failure as king. Saul did everything in his power in order to prevent that from happening, and David, meanwhile, did everything he could to avoid a confrontation. He didn't want to fight Saul. But a final showdown between the two of them appeared inevitable unless David could get some outside help. So that's the situation we find ourselves in today, as both David and Saul make use of some surprising people and discover some unintended consequences as a result. And from those consequences, from what they do here, we want to gather an important lesson. To understand that God is ultimately the one we have to turn to in everything that we're up against. Because his enemies cannot stand against him. And his judgments against them will come to pass. So we need to stand with him instead. And to know that we don't have to fear any evil when we are on his side. So for this today, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 27 to start. And hopefully you're already turned there in your Bibles. But if not, go ahead and take a moment to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 27, or to grab a Bible if you need to do that out on the table in the entryway. And it's just always good to follow along, I think, especially when we're reading these types of stories, when there's a lot of narrative involved, because you're going through a lot of verses. And so if you want to be able to refer back to something that we said, it's probably not going to be on the slide anymore, so you need your own Bible to be able to check that out. But in any case, 1 Samuel 27 at verse 1. It says that David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines, and Saul will despair of me, to seek me any more in any part of Israel. So I shall escape out of his hand." Then David arose and went over with the 600 men who were with him to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. So David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. Then David said to Achish, "If I've now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day, and therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. And David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. Then Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David would say, "Against the southern area of Judah," or "against the southern area of the Jerahmeelites," or "against the southern area of the Kenites." David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, "Thus David did." And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, "He's made his people Israel utterly abhor him. Therefore he will be my servant forever." Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, "You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men." So David said to Achish, "Surely you know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Therefore I will make you one of my chief guardians forever." So going back to the beginning of the chapter here, it's a pretty stunning situation, born out of how desperate David was to avoid that fight with Saul. It left him believing his only option was to go to the Philistines, which, remember, he had tried before. He'd done this once already. That was when he had to pretend to be insane in order to be able to get out of Gath. But that had been immediately after Saul's first attempt on his life. It was also very shortly after the death of Goliath, who was from Gath, and David had gone alone. So now things are different. That's why he's thinking that this might work this time. He has a considerable fighting force, 600 men that he's got alongside him. And also, this has been after years, a long-standing, very public feud with Saul. So it's obvious that he's not working for Israel anymore, at least not working for the king. And so that's why the king of Gath, or the lord of Gath, depending on how you're looking at it, but that's why he was inclined to accept him. although Achish may have been the only one who was really happy to have him there. David brought his men, who brought their families and all their livestock. So that's an infusion of more than 1,000 Hebrews in this Philistine city and thousands of animals. They probably would not have gotten a very warm welcome from all the other people who lived there, just because they were going to make it crowded. But in that, David apparently saw an opportunity. That's why he asks Achish to give him his own territory. He presents it as basically reducing the tension. Get us out into the country a little bit, and then everybody will be more comfortable. And Achish is more than happy to do so because he sees that he and David are on the same page. They're both working now from that age-old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And we've all heard that, and that's what they are both acting on here. Because for David, going to the enemy of Saul meant escaping Saul, whereas for Achish, it meant gaining a committed ally against Saul's Israel. Or at least that's what he thought, since that's what David told him, but it wasn't what David did. This was the other reason, by the way, that he asked for a separate city, so he could have a secret base of operations, to be able to go out and attack Israel's enemies. That's what he was doing. Those people that their cities that he attacked, they were allies of the Philistines, but they were people whose destruction God had commanded as part of taking the promised land. So David is continuing that. He's building on the conquest that had been started by Joshua hundreds of years beforehand, but then he was saying he was actually attacking Israelites. So what he would do is he would go and he would take all their stuff, and then he'd bring back some of it to Achish in order to pay him and say that it was coming from Saul's kingdom, when it was really coming from his own, is how he was doing this. It's very clever. Carefully carried out to ensure it's not discovered, and Achish believed, because of it, that David was truly on his side and had made it so he had no friends left at home. Because if he's attacking Israelites, it's obviously what you'd assume. It worked very well. It worked a little too well. David, of course, would probably claim that he was doing this for God. I can't go so far as to say one way or another what God would have thought about and whether he appreciated it being done this way, but David does end up being essentially caught in his lie. He's put now in a position where he is actually going to have to fight his own people if he's going to be with the rest of the Philistine army. Now, when he's told this, he keeps up the deception and says he's ready and raring to go. We can only imagine the stress he was actually feeling in this moment, and he probably would have been praying for a way out, but we don't see that right away because the narrator moves the story. He shifts its focus in order to allow the tension to keep building as we wonder, what is David going to do here? And as we switch over to see what Saul was doing at this same time. This is what comes next in chapter 28 at verse 3. It says, this is after Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented and buried him in Ramah in his own city. It's also after Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, find me a woman who's a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. So the servants said to him, in fact, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor. So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went, and 2 of his men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, please conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you. Then the woman said to him, look, don't you know what Saul has done, how he's cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land? Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? You're Saul. The king said to her, don't be afraid, just tell me, what did you see? And the woman said to Saul, I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth. So he said to her, what's his form? And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he's covered with a mantle." And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I'm deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me and does not answer me anymore, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I've called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do." Then Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, seeing that the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground and was dreadfully afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day or night. Saul's anxiety is understandable, but we have to remember it's also of his own making. His disobedience caused God to leave him. He had killed the priests, and he had alienated the prophets when his relationship with Samuel broke down. And so he is all alone. And his desperation in that moment drove him to a dangerous ally. This is yet another example of how far he'd fallen, sadly, because he knew better. He knew that Spiritism was wrong. In better days, early in his reign, he had worked to root it out, which, by the way, is something that we should, not using the same methods, but something we should still be doing. We should be working against the influence of psychics and astrologers. And we need to understand what is truly evil about them, too. Because it's not just that they are charlatans, which they are. It's also not even just the demonic aspect of it. Because Christians, very often, we tend to focus on that they are in communication with demons. There's truth to that. There is a danger there as well, although maybe it's more overstated than we might tend to think, because again, usually they're just charlatans. They're just lying. They're using tricks of psychology in order to tell people what they want to hear. But even if they are getting a little bit of outside help, I guess we could call it, from the satanic, that's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is what they are pretending to offer, wherever it's coming from, which is knowledge of the future and control over death, by saying that they can communicate with the dead and that the dead can give answers about things that are yet to come. There's only one who has that power, and it's the Lord God Almighty. And so when people say that they have that to give, they're lying. And to listen to them does not only mean that they are worthless, it is what truly makes them dangerous. And it is so frustrating to hear, as I have, and I know others of you had as well, that somebody who walks in, I worked at Majesty, somebody's in there buying Bibles, and I hear them talking about how I'm going to go see my psychic on Saturday before I go to church on Sunday. That's absurd. Christians should not be engaging in this. Christians should be fighting against this. But it was what Saul wanted. And so the Lord let him have it, didn't he? Samuel does come up at this woman's call. Now notice, she's shocked by that, isn't she? Which means she'd never done it before. She was a charlatan. She was a liar. She'd been faking it for years. Now it's actually worked, because she wasn't really the one doing it. God allowed it to happen in order to deliver judgment, because this was Saul's final straw. Samuel told him nothing that he wanted to hear, which had been just the nature of their relationship for a long time. Back in chapter 13, he told him he wasn't going to have a dynasty. And then in chapter 15, he said that he was going to lose the kingdom. It would be given to another. Now he receives a death sentence. And it is for this very act. Consulting necromancers was a capital crime in Israel. Required the death penalty under the law of Moses, the one that God had given. And the king is not above the law. Just what he had so often tried to ignore. He refused to learn that lesson, so now he's going to be forced to accept the consequences of his failure. And it leaves Saul utterly broken. It's the state in which the story now leaves him. It switches back again, goes to David to see how he responded in the difficult spot that he'd put himself in. So this is what we now find in chapter 29. In verse 1, it says, "The Philistines gathered together all their armies at Aphek, and the Israelites encamped by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed in review by hundreds and by thousands. David and his men passed in review at the rear with Achish. Then the princes of the Philistines said, 'What are these Hebrews doing here?' And Achish said to the princes of the Philistines, 'Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, but who's been with me these many days, or even these years? And to this day I found no fault in him since he defected to me.' But the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, 'Make this fellow return, and he may go back to the place which you've appointed for him, and don't let him go down with us to the battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Then Achish called David and said to him, 'Surely as the Lord lives, you've been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army is good in my sight, for this day I found no evil in you. It's not since the day of your coming to me. Nevertheless, the lords do not favor you. Therefore return now and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines.' So David said to Achish, 'But what have I done? To this day what have you found in your servant as long as I've been with you, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?' Then Achish answered and said to David, 'I know that you are as good in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now therefore rise early in the morning with your master's servants who have come with you, and as soon as you are up early in the morning and have light, depart.' So David and his men rose early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel." So, like I said, David kind of created this situation for himself. The Lord provided a way for him to get out of it by letting the rest of the Philistines be smarter than Achish was. They knew what a threat David was, and they feared that he might turn on them in the middle of the battle. Something that had actually happened before, back in 1 Samuel chapter 14, one of Saul's wars with them. There were some Israelites who were with the Philistines until things started going well for the other Israelites, and then they switched sides in the middle of the battle. So it's happened before, there's history, and to be fair, it's probably exactly what David would have done if he had needed to go into this fight. But instead, they force Achish to make him go home. Now, meanwhile, for me at least, it's kind of hard to not almost feel bad for Achish here. He truly seems to care for David. He's entirely convinced of his loyalty. He even praises David's virtue in Yahweh's name. The Lord is who he references here. I kind of hope the sincerity of Achish made David feel at least a little bit guilty just with the things that he'd been doing to this guy. But for safety's sake, David lies one more time, although it's even a little bit of a risk. Because if he'd done it well enough, who knows? If he pushed it too far, he might have been able to convince the other Philistines to let him go into the battle. But instead, and I'm sure with a sigh of relief, he turned home, only to find that his playing of both sides still had other consequences. So we go to chapter 30 now. At verse 1, it says, "It happened, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag and attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but they carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Then David called to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, and said, "Please bring the ephod here to me." And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them?" And he answered, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all." That's what happens. We drop down to verse 17. It says, David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and herds that they had driven before those other livestock and said, "This is David's spoil." So the first stage of this, of course, is an utter disaster. There's no bodies in Ziklag, at least, but that just meant all their families were going to be sold in slavery. That's why you would capture people at the time. And David and his men, they had no idea who had done this, because it's already a couple days removed. So they don't even know which direction to go. And they have nowhere to turn for help, which, of course, is what the Amalekites were counting on. David had attacked them in secret, but clearly they'd figured it out, and now they're returning the favor. Knowing that he couldn't get any Israelite help, he's in Philistine territory. Also knowing that he couldn't risk explaining the situation to the Philistines. And they were all busy anyway, fighting their own war against each other. So this was really perfectly timed on the Amalekites' part. And then to top it all off, David's own men turn against him. Now maybe with some justification, because again, the wisdom of David being in Philistine territory and then also attacking all of these people secretly, they could kind of blame him for this to some extent. But of course, this is really just people doing what people so commonly do, is that in tough situations that we can't face on our own, and somebody out there that we can't reach, what do? We lash out at the people who are close enough to reach. The people who really we should be looking to them for help. They're the ones who are actually going to get us through our struggles. Instead, we turn against them. So that's what they've done. But David didn't make the same mistake. He had been too clever before, too clever by half, as they say. But now he realized he couldn't really, truly rely on Israel or on Achish or even on his own men. Strength could only ultimately come from one source. And so it's actually on the same day that Saul went to see that witch in Endor, David turned to the Lord, who told him to pursue the enemy and then directed him, actually the way that he found them, he directed David to a slave of the Amalekites that the Amalekites had left behind because he was sick, because God had made him sick so that he could be left behind for David to find. And that slave was able to tell David where they had gone so that he could attack them in a surprise, and God gave David victory over them that way, as we read here, along with the recovery of their families, their things, and more. Once again, David has gained triumph by faith. But now we'll see Saul experience the final defeat of faithlessness. In the last chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 31, at verse 1, it says, "The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me.' But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together that same day. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those who were on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled. And the Philistines came and dwelt in them. And so it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the walls of Bethshan. Now, when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men there arose and traveled all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. As predicted, the Israelites could not stand against the Philistines. Three of Saul's sons died in that battle, and Saul, badly wounded, killed himself to avoid the humiliating fate of Samson. That's really what he's worried about here. Now, we can wonder at the justice of all of this, not so much for Saul as for especially Jonathan, who we know was an incredibly humble and faithful man who had always been there for David. And so it doesn't necessarily seem fair, but we do have to recognize this as, first of all, Saul's fault, and second of all, as Jonathan's choice. So when it comes to Saul, knowing what he did, he should have sent his sons away. And sure, if it was going to be the final word of God that it was their day to die, then it wasn't going to matter where they were in the world. But still, you would think as a father that he would want to do something in order to try to protect them. He doesn't do that. He wants them there fighting for him in the hopes that God's word can still somehow be undone. He's completely and selfishly focused on saving himself. But Jonathan also does have an impact on this. He stayed to the bitter end because he was a patriot, because he loved his country, his people, his God, and his father, in spite of everything that was there between them. So he served faithfully. He was the consummate warrior and died the warrior's death. A good death, you could say, as far as it is possible for a death to be good. That was what he was able to experience in this moment. And we must also see how this fits into God's plans. Because for one thing, in a practical sense, with 3 of Saul's sons dying here, this means less rivals for David, whom God had determined to make king. So even if Jonathan, I think it's pretty safe to assume he would not have fought for his own claim to the crown, but other people might have done it on his behalf. And then you have the 2 other sons. We have no idea. They may have tried to claim their father's throne as well. There is a 4th son, who we're going to be talking about next week. That's exactly what he does. And so this is part of that. This is making it easier for David. But going even further than that, we have to take the very long view. It is true, absolutely true, that Jonathan trusted the Lord. He believed his promises. And even though he would not have known the full nature of God's promises, he trusted him. And so we can be certain that his death here was not his death forever. He is with the Lord. And that is greater, and that overcomes this loss and the question of fairness that's involved here. Now, as for Saul, of course, we're obviously not going to assume the same. Now, it is kind of a complicated situation to evaluate, even as this last episode does make clear. Because we do have to remember, his reign started with great promise. One of the good things that he had done early on was to save the people of this town, Jabesh-Gilead, that's mentioned here, from a foreign invasion. And that's why they so fondly remembered him and so boldly honored him by retrieving his remains, as befitted the Lord's anointed, in spite of how far he had fallen. But there's no denying that he had fallen very far, that he had made himself God's enemy. This was the end to which Saul brought himself by looking in all the wrong places for help. And David at least flirted with that same mistake before he reminded himself of what it was that he really needed. Well, we have similar choices to make, even if they may not seem like such a matter of life and death. We started today talking about that phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Very common. But it's even more important to know that the enemy of my friend is my enemy. Maybe a little hard to track, but this is a biblical truth. This is what we find in James chapter 4, verse 4. It says, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?" So what this is saying is that those who choose the world and its ways and its rebellion against God and to be its friend, well, God is its enemy. So that makes us his enemy too. And who doesn't do that? Everyone does. But we don't have to stay on the wrong side because of what we find in Romans chapter 5, verses 6 to 10. When we were still without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Yet perhaps for a good man, someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. This is what everything comes down to. We do not deserve it. God, as our enemy, could have really just left us to our own devices, could have allowed us to face the consequences of trying to go against him. But instead, Jesus Christ came here to live as one of us, to die for all of us. But he did not die forever. He rose. He defeated the greatest enemy of God and man, death itself, so that we, who were the enemies of God, could become his friends and could go from death to life instead. That's why he is, in the end, the only one to whom we can turn. When we suffer disappointments, when we feel surrounded, when we don't know where to go next, we have to remember that he has given us victory. That's how we strengthen ourselves in him. Now, for anyone who is not a Christian, that's what we invite you to do. To understand that without Jesus, you're pursuing your own destruction as surely as Saul did. But with Jesus, you cannot be defeated. So don't remain God's enemy. Ask for forgiveness. Believe in Jesus for eternal life, and it's yours. You don't have to keep trying to rely on yourself for the future. If that's a decision that anyone here is ready to make, and you also want to do that publicly, because you would want to share that with this church family, to be able to make that declaration here, to have our strength, to strengthen you, then you can do so. I'll be standing off to the side during the song that plays for communion, and I'm more than happy to have that conversation. But if that's not so much, if you kind of fear the public speaking aspect of that, or not even here, and you're watching this somewhere else, it's still a decision that you can make wherever you are by declaring it to God. That's who you're speaking to, in order to say that you know that you have done things that went against him, that you are sorry for, that you cannot make up. You are asking Jesus to do it for you, and you believe that his death paid the price and his resurrection washes it away. That's what we are saying to do, and it is all you have to do. So I hope that you will, that you'll do it today, that you won't wait any longer, because you don't have what Saul did. You don't know when your end is going to come. And you don't want to wait until it's too late. But for believers, for us, I want to say, I know we have daunting challenges. We're supposed to face them prudently, to try to be clever. That was what David was trying to do in the situation that he was in. But don't forget that trusting the Lord is the height of wisdom. If you forget to put Him first, your sticky places are just going to get stickier. But when you do turn to Him, He will get you through them. And as you go through, let your strength in God be a light to others, even to those who maybe are causing your trouble, so that they can see Christ the unconquerable, and so that they can take His side before they experience the fate of all His enemies.